Welcome to Lenten Conversations with Good Samaritan Church in Pinellas Park, Florida. All right, well, thank you, Carolyn and Chance, for being with me today and having this conversation. As we've been doing all throughout the season of Lent, we are looking at each of the things that Jesus said from the cross. And today we're talking about one of the more intimate things he said, something he said to his mother and to the only one of Jesus' disciples who we believe was actually there at the cross for his crucifixion. The disciple who is just referred to as the disciple he loved, or the beloved disciple. He says to them, "Woman, behold thy son," and then turns to the disciple, "Behold thy mother." So today I want to explore what's happening here in this intimate moment. What would you say is happening here?
Well, I think that it definitely shows the selflessness of Christ, and that in that moment when he was suffering so greatly, that he would think of his mother and perhaps even his disciples' need for that companionship. There's just a deep love and a selflessness going on.
Okay, so this is this selfless act. Would you say the same thing, Chance?
I would, and I would add to that. One of the things that's interesting to me is he doesn't call her mother. He says woman, and that's always struck me. And so when I was thinking about this and reading some different commentaries, I found that there is a school of thought that maybe he said woman because mother might have been too difficult for her to hear. She was already hurting, and for him to call out to his mother from the cross in a moment of pain might have just compounded that pain that she was already feeling. And so I just think that re-emphasizes that selflessness that Carolyn was talking about. I think he was really in a way protecting her from feeling some of that pain.
Thank you. That's insightful. Well, it reminds me a lot of some of the stories we hear in the LGBTQ community when people have lost or been rejected by their own family. LGBTQ plus folks sometimes form these families of choice. Is that what Jesus is doing? Is he trying to give his mother and his beloved disciple a family that will be tethered not by blood relation, but by choice and by covenant?
Short answer is yes. I think that could be what's happening. I think it still goes back to that selflessness again, where he wants to make sure that he cared for both of them, so he wants to make sure that they are cared for. And I think, as you mentioned, the LGBTQ community, there are so many amazing people out there that will bring people in and make sure that people are taken care of, even when everyone else has kind of turned their back on them.
Yeah, I think about the way in LGBT communities, there's kind of that stand-in family that often comes around you. If your family of origin has rejected you, there's a stand-in family that comes around you. And the same thing happens for a lot of people when they're grieving. Sometimes we call people widows and orphans, but people who have lost the most closest, most significant family members, others will often rally around them. And I see that sometimes at Good Sam too, others who will, you can never replace those people, but try to come in and be that support and those stand-in family members for them. What is your experience like with family of choice? Have you ever had non-blood relatives stand in as your family?
I have many friends that I consider more, I guess, like family to me. I can certainly depend on them. And of course, Jean is my spouse and family. But I guess when I went through my breakup of my first long term relationship, there was a mutual friend to both me and my former partner that I wasn't quite sure if they would be my friend anymore, still. And her name was Naomi. And so we got in contact with each other. And for many months, she and I emailed each other, and she encouraged me. She's Mennonite and very supportive of our relationship. And I guess took me through the grieving process. And it was a situation where none of my family understood the pain, because to them, I just lost a friend. What's the big deal, But to me, it was my uh, life partner. So it was very, very healing to have that time, extended time of communicating with Naomi.
Yeah, I think there's well, what is the old adage? There's friends and there's family, and then there's friends that become family. I think that is it's so true. Some of the people that I'm closest with in my life, we have no blood relation whatsoever, but we're family. We're a family by choice, and they have been with me through thick and thin. And since my faith is central to my life, I most of those people are in faith communities that I've been a part of, and I wouldn't take anything for those friends that became family.
Hmm. Yeah, I am very lucky that at least my immediate family was very supportive when I came out. But I have to say, for most of my adult life now, having lived on the opposite coast from where all my family lives, oftentimes the congregations I have been a part of have almost served as a surrogate family. I remember still the very first seizure our son Jacob had here after we had come to Good Sam, and Julie was in the ambulance with him and I was following in the car behind with Joelle, and Julie texted a number of people in the congregation and just said, "Can you pray for us?" And we arrived at the ER, and there were several Good Sam members already sitting in the ER, just waiting to swoop Joelle up so I could go back with Julie and Jacob, and just having this overwhelming sense of family. And I think that's one of the spiritual gifts of this congregation of Good Sam, for me at least, has been people really know how to be family of choice to each other. And there's a lot of people in our congregation who need that, who don't have family or relatives to care for them.
I think especially here, and so many people come here and they retire here and they don't have family, blood family um, here with them. But I've heard stories in the last few weeks of people that are scheduling vaccine appointments for their neighbors and driving them to get their vaccines. I mean, it's really amazing to see the way that people step up to take care of people who otherwise would have no one to do that for them.
Mm-hmm. Well, looking back over the Gospels, what are some of Jesus' family values? He has some he has some pretty out of the box things to say about families and family bonds, and some of them sound downright offensive to our ears. What are those things that he says about families, and what experiences do you think shaped those values?
I'll be honest, there are still some passages that I just really struggle with sometimes. I'm thinking about it's Luke chapter 9 when someone's father has died and he wants to bury him, and Jesus' response is, "Let the dead bury their own dead." That's sounds pretty harsh to me. So
Yeah, or where is it where Jesus says, "I've come basically to turn family members against each other," right?
mhm.
Yeah, even when Jesus was a boy in the temple, and to me, it's sort of strange that Mary and Joseph didn't know for several hours that Jesus was not with them. But I guess they were traveling in a huge caravan or whatever, and you know, uh, I I'm not sure, but it seemed that Jesus was staying back and confounding the people in the temple when they found him, and for him to say, I've got to be about my Father's business. And um, so that sort of set the stage for some of the ways that um, their relationship seemed to go. Even at the marriage in Canaan, when Mary insisted that he change the water into wine, it seemed that he was resistant at that point. And she just said, well, y'all just do what he says. I mean, she kind of pushed the issue, and he did it, which was, interesting. And I think that it was, I'm not sure why, after resisting, that he went ahead and did it, but perhaps out of respect for her.
That temple story you mentioned brings up an interesting point, that Jesus referred to God as Abba, or Father, which was this pretty intimate way of referring to God as family, basically, and also referred to himself oftentimes as the Son of Man, or the Son of Humanity. And so he had this sense that, yes, he had his biological family that he was born into, but that he was a part of this spiritual family that included God and all of humanity as well.
I just always, that story about them leaving him, just it reminds me of my poor parents who, for whatever reason, one Sunday night, because we went to church Sunday morning, Sunday night, and Wednesday night, for whatever reason, that Sunday night they drove separately, and I was playing with my friends after church. Each one thought that I rode home with the other one, and it wasn't until they got home that they realized they had left me, which I was fine. I had 50 cents and went next door and got an ice cream and just sat on the steps of the porch waiting on them to get back. That was the business that I was all about then. But that story, it always makes me think of that instance. But to Pastor Jim's point, it's in Mark chapter 3 where Jesus, he kind of asked a strange question. Who are my mother? Who is my mother and my brothers and my sisters? And he kind of looks around the room and he says, everyone that does the will of God is my brother and my sister and my mother. So it's almost like he looked at his family as being much broader than Mary and Joseph. And, it was, like you said, it was much bigger than that.
Well, and Jesus had some tension with his family too, particularly as he entered ministry, right? They try to kind of stop him from doing the ministry he's doing. And so he has to make this choice at some point between his family and what he feels God is calling him to do. And even in his own hometown, I mean, he's pretty rejected. He's chased out of town in his own hometown, right? And so the place of his origin, the family of his origin, doesn't end up being the path. And of course, Mary's there at the cross, and so at some point, I think his family has kind of come around to his ministry, but there is this tension. And Carolyn brought up, there's this tension at the beginning of his ministry in the Gospel of John, when Jesus' mother wants him to to help the hosts of this wedding feast, and he's pretty hesitant and resistant, and it seems like he's often having to kind of make choices about where's the real family.
Yeah, in John 7:1-9, it talks about that his brothers wanted him to go to this festival, and it sort of intimates that they're wanting him to perform miracles and do things that would sort of show off his powers. And I guess that's sort of like if you're the cousin of a movie star, you want to hang out with them and be, have your own gratification because you're close to them. But Jesus, refuses to go and says, y'all go ahead to the festival. I'm staying here. So, he, I think, probably realized their motive, maybe.
Well, it's kind of fascinating hearing all this. There's this sense of just something very different than the family values that we often hear of, especially in this country from the Christian right, we're always hearing all these values, and yet when we look at Jesus' actual values, they're a little bit different and actually really radical, and a little hard to make sense of, I would say. Now, we already got a little bit into this, but Jesus' relationship with his own family, would you say they were close, or was it strained?
I've often wondered, though, if, what was Jesus' childhood like? I was watching a movie once, and it was portraying something. I can't remember the movie, but there's a scene in the movie where Jesus is building what looks like a table, and Mary comes outside and she's carrying a bucket of water, and she just casually splashes the person portraying Jesus with water, and they giggle and laugh for a minute. And then I'm thinking, what, I never really thought about Jesus having that kind of relationship with anyone. I've often wondered what his relationship was like with Joseph, and if mom said no, did he go to dad? So it's fascinating to think about. I think there was some tension. I mean, I can't imagine being Mary or Joseph. So I think there has to be some tension. I think that Jesus, as we've already talked about, him wanting to carry out his ministry and them not really understanding that and what all that meant, there likely is tension. I mean, I think anyone who's in any relationship is going to have some tension from time to time. So,
And I think that even the fact that he was the firstborn, I know in our family, the firstborn son was revered, and all of my life, of course, I was 3 when he got married, so I really didn't know him that much. And I can imagine that possibly even the fact that I don't know how much it was talked about that Joseph wasn't his biological father, or I don't know what the dynamics of the family was, but I do know that being the firstborn sometimes can set you aside and set you as a sort of an example to achieve, or that can incite some jealousies or whatever sometimes. And there's a lot of expectations for the firstborn that sometimes are not on the the children that come after. So
Well, and in that culture in particular, I mean, the firstborn would have been the one whose responsibility it was to care for and provide for the family. They weren't the one to go off and pursue some other calling. And so, that Jesus does is a little out of the norm. The tension with his family, I try to imagine what it would have been like for his family as Jesus is going about doing all this ministry, and all these people are starting to follow him, and you see the real difference he's making in the world, but you also see that he's kind of pissing off the authorities. You've got to be pretty worried for him as his family. And so it's not really surprising to me that they show up and try to take him home, because, if you're hearing some of the rumors about, that he's stirring the pot, and the powers that be are after him. I don't know, if that was one of my family members, I might be trying to stop them too. And I kind of think about our big fast, our justice actions every year when we invite our elected officials. And we always say we don't create the tension, but we certainly raise the tension of injustice to the surface. And Jesus was certainly doing that. He was raising the tension of all the injustices present in his community to the surface. And it does get uncomfortable to hold those in power accountable to doing justice. So I kind of understand where some of that tension may have been coming from, his brothers both wanting to kind of put him on display and show him off, but at the same time kind of wanting to hide him away and say,
yeah.
don't stir the pot anymore. So tell me, we've talked a little bit about possibly how close he was with his mother. Tell me about this disciple he loved. The disciple in John's gospel is only referred to as this beloved disciple. Who is this? And where else does the gospel mention this disciple?
I've always thought that it was John, and that's sort of who I've been taught that it was. And I know I, have read where there were other opinions about that, but and even in the Gospel of John, I believe that he was referring to himself possibly, but uh, and I think there was a very very special, intimate, close relationship with them that John was a special support for Jesus that maybe he could talk to. And I think about, John and Peter being close and uh, such a different, um, seems to be a different relationship or personality, I guess. Peter was always out there and boisterous and saying anything and everything. And I tend to think of John as more reserved. And when they allowed him in the when Jesus was on trial and they allowed John in to sort of an inner court before Peter, I thought about that, that yeah, Peter would his reputation preceded him.
I too have always thought it was John. I mean, John's gospel certainly mentions the one that Jesus loved in some form or another multiple times, but there's a lot of different schools of thought. Some people think it's not one person or a particular disciple, although it I have a hard time thinking that way myself, because it almost seems like when he's on the cross, he's saying it to a specific person that's standing there. And so, who that is, I don't know. It's one of those questions that I say that I'll ask when I get to heaven, and then it won't matter. But some people even say it's Lazarus.
Mm.
And I don't know. It's very interesting to think about who it was, but I really just lean toward it being John, partly because that's what I've always been taught, but maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, it certainly seems to be one of our better scholarly guesses as to who it could be, and possibly Lazarus, this guy that a few days before Jesus had brought out of his own tomb. That's an interesting possibility to think about. Well, given all that we know about his relationships with his mother and this disciple, what do we think is happening in this moment when he makes this declaration that knits them together as a family?
I think both of them had followed him pretty closely and perhaps had denied other relationships that they could have had because of following him and being close. I think that that closeness he wanted to protect them both at that moment.
Yeah, we saw not long before this in John's gospel, we see this intimate moment when Jesus discovers his friend Lazarus has died, and he comes to the scene where everyone is weeping and wailing and grieving, and he's overwhelmed by emotion too and ends up weeping. Shortest verse in the Bible, Jesus wept. And here I have to sense that there's this empathy. Jesus has experienced grief, and now he sees these two people who love him so much, and they're in so much grief, and he's giving them to each other, making sure that they have each other.
I think for that emotional support, they have each other, but I'm sure that Mary and whoever this disciple is, their lives were probably in danger themselves. They risk being tried or even beaten or murdered. So it was a way for them to take care of each other too. I really think it goes back to what we said in the beginning. This is Jesus, a very selfless act when he's dying and in pain himself, wanting to make sure that his mother and this disciple that he loves so much that they're taken care of.
Well, and as firstborn, he might have felt that obligation, that responsibility, right? Especially toward his mother, of making sure that she was provided for. But he had brothers. Why do you think he chooses to give her this beloved disciple of his, and say, this is your son?
I think about the misunderstanding of so many of the disciples, and I'm sure um, Mary could not see into the future, the plan of God, that Jesus would, I think a lot of them thought that Jesus was going to set up a kingdom on earth right then. And so this was so devastating to all of those who had followed him. And I'm sure his mother, who had, you know, gone through the prophecy of, meeting with the angel, and the angel told her she was going to have this child. And she knew her whole life that this baby was special, that this guy was special. And then to have this happen, I think that Jesus just knew that she was going through something even deeper than any other mother, because of all of that expectation and all of that joy that she had had in her life from raising him, and then for it to end like this. And I don't think anyone else could understand that other than a disciple, that possibly could have started to understand the process and the plan of where the kingdom actually was. So I'm, I think Jesus just knew that she needed someone that was close to him.
And I wonder also if he knew that this disciple of his needed her. I mean,
Yeah.
this disciple had been following him for what, probably about 3 years, but his mother had believed in him, and in God's plan for him. I mean, at least if we read the gospel account, since his birth. And if anyone was going to keep the faith, maybe it was her. And maybe he knew that she would bolster him.
And it's interesting that this disciple seems to be, by the accounts that we have, the only disciple that was there at the crucifixion. That speaks highly of this disciple and his relationship with Jesus. So there was that strong bond, definitely.
This feels to me like this super intimate moment, like maybe a moment we're not even supposed to be privy to, like maybe we're kind of eavesdropping on this, but we get to hear it. Is there anything here in this moment that's for us? Is there anything here that kind of gives us hope or paints this picture of what life in God's household is like, will be like?
I think during this time that we've been going through this past year, with so much solidarity, I mean, the people being alone so much, that our reaching out, I mean, even Jen, you having enough compassion and will to study and learn the way to do Zoom and to do church in this, hard time, that says so much to me about the love that you have for our congregation. And I think that the willingness to do that is just maintaining those relationships and building the community in a way that God would have us to do. And this is just a great example of such a hard time that we've been going through, but yet our church leadership and our denominational leadership has just reached out and done what had to be, done to make it happen, and keep people safe. And I know there are people who perhaps have fallen through the cracks that we need to, continue to reach out to. But even during this isolation, I think that we've seen those opportunities and stepped up to meet them. Our food pantry is just, I think those are the kind of ministries that Jesus was talking about. It's like feet on the ground, doing it for the people who need it most.
Well, let's talk about that for a minute. As I think about this time that we're living in right now, this is, 2021, and it's this year when American families, and even families of choice, they're a lot of them fracturing over politics. It's a time when, due to the pandemic, where we've been surrounded by death, more death than most of us have before, and a lot of losses. It's a time when, for the last year at least, we've been more isolated and distanced than we've ever been before, when we're having to learn how to do family and love and keep connection in some new ways. It's this time of cancel culture. You've probably heard that phrase, but cancel culture that's meant that a lot of people are cutting off relationships with loved ones that they deem toxic. And I know, at least in our congregation, I've already heard a few stories of people who've experienced that. And we're also just living in an era when, due to job availability, a lot of people are much more transient than they used to be. You know, you don't stay in your same hometown your whole life. Often the family ends up dispersed all over the place, all over the country, sometimes even the globe. I know for my family, we're all over the country. Is there anything here in this beautiful moment with Jesus and his mother and this beloved disciple that really speaks into that 2021 reality? Carolyn, you already mentioned a little bit of it.
I think for me, and going back to the other question about, is there anything that gives us hope? I get this strong sense that even though we may feel like it sometimes, we're not alone. God makes sure that we have people in our lives to help us along the journey. We're not on this journey by ourselves. And I feel like that's the hope that I get from Jesus connecting these two that were likely already connected, but saying out loud that they are together in this journey. And I think when I hear the stories of things that people are doing now to take care of each other, it just reinforces that we're not alone. And actually, this pandemic has taught me that we are more connected than I ever thought we were to begin with. I mean, I have to say that I never really thought about, the cashier at the grocery store and how essential they were to me getting my food. And on and on and on it goes. And we are just so connected because we're in this journey that we're on together. And so that gives me hope, and it makes me realize that I'm not in this by myself.
Hearing that that hymn, "Blessed be the tie that binds," and yeah, there's this sense of, when we're in our moments of grief and loss, when our whole world feels like it's crumbling and upside down, God gives us to each other. We're not left alone. And thank you for both of you touching on that. One last question. Is there anything in this moment at the cross that invites you to live differently here and now?
I think for me, it's just to continue to reach out and see what I can do to help someone else who may be having a very difficult time, whether that be grief or it's just finding ways to help when I can.
I agree.
I think about the fierceness of my love for my family, especially as a mother for my children. And, started this pandemic kind of stranded in Europe, trying to get us all home safely, and then keep everyone safe and provided for and all that throughout this time. And I think this moment at the cross reminds me that ferocity of love is what we're meant to have for all of our human siblings, everyone in the human family, that we are meant to care for each other like family, like that.
Yeah, I'm reminded of when Jesus asked, who is our neighbor? And I think more than ever before, this is a time when we need to reach out and realize that anyone around us who's in need, who needs love, needs comfort, needs a bag of groceries, there's so many opportunities right now to be a neighbor.
Well, thank you both for this wonderful conversation.
What